Hello, students of British and American culture. This is the Monday version of this class. I've been informed that my lectures are a little bit long-winded, and I'm aware of that. In this class in particular, it's very difficult to keep the length of the lectures short enough for your attention span. Um, so, in the interest of making it more manageable, I already split last week our lectures into two parts. However, reality has set in, I think, and perhaps it's even better for both you and I if I maybe even split this lecture into three. I want to get all the material to you. I know it takes a long time to absorb what I'm saying, but if you're reading the textbook, you know there's a lot of material that I have to cover and you have to understand. Also, I'm just skipping so many things that I want to talk about, and I can't. The situation is going to get worse and worse as we get closer to the present. So last week was 16th century, and today I'm going to talk about the 17th century. We're going to try and get close to the mid-18th century by next week so that we can talk about the things that increasingly become more relevant to your life and what things that you can relate to, especially things like the Industrial Revolution. So this is a period I think that I didn't study as much as I probably should have, and as I taught this course, I became increasingly aware that although I knew a lot about, 1585, especially 1585 up to 1620 or so, from Henry VII all the way to James that everything that happened up until that point kind of culminated in Charles I and the English Civil War, and that the English Civil War is really not studied enough. It's really a tragedy for everyone because it was it's a significant turning point, and it had a critical effect on British and English culture. It was a sort of forebearer of the French Revolution. That's what I studied when I was in high school and in university. My history of Western civilization class didn't mention the English Civil War at all. We didn't talk about it. It wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't talked about at all. When we talked about the French Revolution extensively, which is understandable because the French Revolution is probably the most important event in the history of modern European history. That's fine, but it doesn't mean you should ignore the fact that there was a revolution in England 150 years before that. It's the same thing that I never knew about. I never knew about Tyndall. I never knew about the Lollards. I never knew how Chaucer and the sort of the transformation of the English attitude about religion started way before Martin Luther. I studied Martin Luther in Western Civ as well, and nobody ever mentioned to me about Wycliffe, Chaucer, and Tyndall. So I never realized that all of these, there was sort of a parallel development of change of culture going on in England, even though I'm not German or French, but even in Canada, and I'm assuming the curriculum is the same in the United States and United Kingdom, is that, maybe the British probably educate themselves a little bit better about it, but in North America, Martin Luther is a giant, as he should be, and Napoleon and Robespierre and the French Revolution loom very large in the study of our culture, whereas the events in England, in the United Kingdom, don't get talked about as much as they should. So this is what I'm going to do this week, is try and fill in the gaps, because obviously Koreans are the same. If the Americans don't learn it, there's a good chance that people in America, people in Korea don't get the emphasis or the coverage on the topic either, because Koreans in Korea, not just Koreans, but anybody who studies in Korea also gets sort of the American version of many things, and the American curriculum is something that we like to follow here. So as I said to you at the beginning of the course, in a written form and as I delivered my lectures to you, I want to, as much as possible, introduce you to different perspectives. So we got to get into this topic of the 17th century. However, there's a few things I couldn't talk about last week that we have to cover. There's a bit of a transition that happens. Queen Elizabeth dies in 1604, and there's a certain person that I have to mention, because although fully half of this class are from majors other than English, half are you, I would be remiss, whether it's history or English or culture or any other way of looking at this class, if I didn't talk about William Shakespeare. So I just want to talk about him for a few minutes, and then we'll get into just a general perspective of what it's like to be in British culture, especially English culture, but the other, Ireland and Scotland a little bit too, what it's like to live at that time as Queen Elizabeth is getting old and dies at the beginning of the 17th century, what is happening and how things start to change dramatically, just because, I mean, we call the whole second half of the 16th century, it's called Elizabethan for a reason. So there's a lot of different names we use. 16th century, we call it, it's the Reformation is going on, we call it the English Renaissance, we call it the Shakespearean period, we call it the early modern period, and we call it the 16th century. All these things have different exact timelines, but as I told you, I'm not really here to tell you something started in 1520 and ended in 1601. Those numbers are not important. That's why I just said 16th century, and I didn't really mention particular dates, like 1558 is the beginning of Queen Elizabeth's reign and 1604 is the end. Don't worry about those numbers. I'm not going to test you on them. I'm trying to be accurate when I say the numbers, but I don't want you to worry about them. So Shakespeare was, in some ways, in a lot of ways, he is the essential Englishman. Partly because he was not a wealthy person. He, as far as we know, because he wasn't famous when he was growing up, so a lot of people speculate, was it really him, or wasn't? We're not going to get into that. That's one perspective. I've had this discussion with many people, students, English people, Koreans, people from other countries. Who was Shakespeare really? Let's not get into that. Well, all we know is that there's a collection of works that some of them are different from each other. They have different. There are some stylistic differences, but I mean, if we at some point get artificial intelligence to analyze all of his works, and we find that there's a distinct fingerprint that separates these works, according to how they're constructed. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, and everybody else too, but as far as we know, it was one guy who did all this. How was he able to write all this? How was he educated enough to talk about Julius Caesar, talk about ancient Rome, talk about Renaissance Italy and the Merchant of Venice, and Romeo and Juliet, and the history plays about Henry, all the Henrys, and Richards and other things. I'm going to talk about Richard II briefly today. How is he able to talk about all these different things? The tragedies, the comedies. It's a level of genius that has rarely been approached. If I mean, Shakespeare is my favorite. I know it's cliche for an English professor to say, "Oh, my favorite writer is Shakespeare, and my favorite piece of writing is Hamlet." But I'm a cliche. I'm wearing a Steve Jobs type turtleneck, so I'm in terms of my fashion and in terms of my taste in English literature, I'm the most cliche person ever. So I even didn't shave. If I just started to lose a little bit more hair, I'd basically be imitating Steve Jobs exactly. So I'm not here to defend my choice. What I'm saying is there's something about William Shakespeare that catches everybody's attention. But when he wrote, he caught the attention of Queen Elizabeth and he caught the attention of James after King James after her. He drew all the attention towards himself. The court. He supported himself. He never became super rich. If he was alive now, he would be somebody like I don't know who to compare him to. There's nobody to compare him to, but whatever. Steven Spielberg, or Quentin Tarantino, or whatever. The richest, Tom Hanks, the richest, most famous, most successful actors and directors you can think of. That's Shakespeare. But during that time, acting and directing or writing plays or screenwriting didn't get rewarded in that sense, right? Acting was at the bottom of the pyramid. So like if you were a rich guy who owned a lot of land, or you were a general in the military and you won victories for the king or something like that, you were at the top of you were the high class individual who had lots of money and a reputation and influence and political power and everything else that comes along with that. You were essentially an early modern celebrity. That's not what Shakespeare was. He was more like I guess something like a professor who was making YouTube videos and supporting himself, and doing fine, supporting his family. He had a lot of kids to take care of, and he had his own business and everything, and he was popular enough, but not a superstar by any means, not even close. Certainly, the fact that he got the attention of the Queen and that he performed his plays for the court was a big deal. But he didn't become an international celebrity until like 100 years after he died. The fact that he was able to do this, though, he was able to support himself and become famous within his sphere, and then later for him to basically be exported and translated and to become the person that we know now as a legendary writer, as somebody who was fundamental to the development of the English language and the promotion of English culture, the explosion of English culture into the international arena, is why Shakespeare is so amazing and why he has to be mentioned in this class. Not because I want you to understand his work or love Hamlet or King Lear or Macbeth or any of the other amazing plays he wrote. You don't have to. You just have to know he's important. And that's why we study him, and that's why he's fundamental to this flowering of English literature, like this opening up and the realization that English is not a language that was not suitable to art or drama, or it wasn't good enough for poetry. There was not just him, there's others. Edmund Spenser is one of my favorites. I'm going to leave people out, but I mentioned these guys before. There's a whole like sort of generation of writers. We might call it Shakespeare's generation because it's towards the end of. It's partly to do with the fact that Queen Elizabeth did encourage these people, Ben Jonson and the contemporaries, Spenser, Shakespeare, Marlowe, among many others. They contributed to the body of English. Sir Philip Sidney. They contributed to the body of English language, and all of a sudden you went from very few things written in English to all of these amazing poems, and this is why I studied it when I was an undergrad, because there is this you can't really study 15th century English literature very well because there's nothing there. There's not nothing there, but there's very little. Yeah, you have these certain people that stand out, like Chaucer, um, through the centuries before, but all of a sudden you get to the end of the 16th century, and then there's just this whole generation of people that write this amazing stuff that that teaches other cultures to appreciate English as a medium for artistic and cultural communication. And you would never think that now, because we have these, we have American culture and British culture they're both very famous. So nobody thinks that at one point 500 years ago, nobody cared. You can't imagine not having Hollywood or, the British invasion, the British music or rock and roll or, poetry and British and Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and everybody else. Nobody can imagine that not happening, but it did start somewhere. And going into the 17th century, you get this massive influx of creative work in English. So that's the good stuff. Let me talk about the bad stuff. Okay? Like I said, I want to give you the general situation. So Queen Elizabeth, I said when I talked about her, I think she deserves to be called Queen Elizabeth the Great. Part of the reason for that is that she was handed a kingdom that was not in good shape. And in some ways, she did turn it around. I mean, by the end of her reign, it's not like England is a superpower or anything, but it's instead of kind of floundering or falling apart, it's kind of cohesive, and it's starting to like turn the corner. There was a point where the Spanish could have stomped on England and just shoved them back down, but instead they kind of, like I said before, the Spanish went like this, and the English were just getting they were important in the Middle Ages. They did have more territory and they did have more influence. But England, in the 15th century, when Henry VII becomes, in 1485, when Henry VII becomes the King of England, they have money problems. They've lost a lot of their territory. The French won the 100 Years' War. They don't have a big navy. They don't have a big population. The Holy Roman Empire and France and Spain have more people. They have more money. They have more resources. They have better military power. So, and they're just geographically in the corner. So England is, at 1500, it's a bit of, we would call it in English a backwater. It's a place where why would you go there? And no offense to anybody who lives in a place that's considered a backwater, because I'm from Northern Ontario, and some people consider where I grew up, why would you go there? There's no entertainment. Like, I lived, in the early summer, there's lots of mosquitoes. People go camping and there's lots of nature and stuff, but there's nothing else. It's a beautiful place. There's flowers and everything, but summer is short in Canada. So, it starts getting cold in October, and then you have 6 months of winter, and there's no movie theaters or shopping malls or rock concerts or hip hop or whatever you like to do. It's not there. There's a short growing season if you're a farmer, and otherwise you just enjoy seeing the animals and trees and mountains and nothing else. Some people would consider that very an unattractive place. I guess there's, in some ways, culturally at least, England was backwater in the 15th century. In the 16th century, that starts to change. By the end of the 16th century, you have Shakespeare. You have a country that has it's reestablished its relationship with other countries. They're bringing in trade, and as I said, Queen Elizabeth liked to, secretly support the pirates, and steal stuff from other people. So you're getting, it's just a lot more activity, and it seems less like it's off in the corner doing relatively little except for trying to exist. Now it's becoming reconnected with Europe, and is starting to expand its navy, and you know, Sir Francis Drake is attacking Spain, and he's going around the world doing these adventures and exploration, and Shakespeare's writing, and Queen Elizabeth is making these great speeches, and they're winning these gigantic battles against empires. All that stuff is the reason why she is considered great. And then she dies without marrying anyone or having any children. So you end up with this guy from Scotland named James I. He's James VI of Scotland, and he comes down and he becomes the King of England. We're going to talk about him next lecture. So I'm just going to talk about what's the state of affairs. And again, I told you, it's sort of one of the things that's really beneficial about this class. One, to understand how things changed and where our culture came from now. Another thing is that some of the things that are happening today, and we'll talk about this again next lecture, things with the coronavirus and crises and difficulties and diseases are not new. They are not. You feel like they're new because you probably grew up, like I did, not worrying about plagues or pandemics or anything like that. But in the 16th century, that's daily life. Getting infected by things and having diseases rip through the country and wipe out people regularly is still a really... It's something that every generation experiences. It's not like us, where the last people who experienced, serious diseases were our grandparents or something like that because of modern medicine. They didn't have that. So something like the coronavirus would have happened every 10 years. When Queen Elizabeth was made queen in 1558, there was an influenza, which is a coronavirus is, I know everybody's saying it's not an influenza, but it's, it's related. It's like a cousin of the regular, what we call the regular flu. It's not really regular, I guess. But back then, the flu was a lot more, it probably was a different flu anyway. I'm not a virologist, so I'm not going to try and explain, but influenza is a very common disease. It's a virus that spreads in animals and humans all the time. So they had an influenza, not a pandemic, an epidemic in England, and it killed a lot of people in the very year that everybody was celebrating Queen Elizabeth's coronation. Simultaneously, there's a whole bunch of people dying because of, the virus. It's sort of, I guess it'll be a similar thing in the United States. I hate to say it, but when the next presidential election in November happens, I hope the problem is gone by then. But there's a good possibility that there will be a presidential election, and the president will be elected in the middle of a disease spreading throughout the country. And that's what Queen Elizabeth did. People forget all these things. So one of the things you have to remember is like disease and sudden it sweeps through the population regularly. So this is something that culturally affects people's attitude about everything. You've probably changed your attitude. I have. Whenever I go outside, I wear a mask. I don't go out my door without wearing a mask. Sometimes I pull the mask down to take a drink or something, but I put that mask on. This is one of the effects of the coronavirus. If you were living in the 16th century or the 17th century and a disease was passing around, you wouldn't really know that the best thing to do was wash your hands and wear a mask or stay away, do social distancing. They wouldn't know that. They would do other things, like I told you before, pray. Probably still be doing dirty stuff and still going on with their life, but they would have different attitudes. They might stay away from certain people, right? Like if I had a certain religion and yours was different, you might stay away from me because you might think that my religion might be a reason for me to get sick and for me to spread it to you. This kind of attitude and stuff is pretty. People are very suspicious of each other for reasons that are not rational, because they don't have science to explain how the disease works. So this kind of thing is something that regularly cripples, trade. It affects people's cultural attitudes. It affects politics. It affects daily life. It affects family life, personal decisions. This is something that happens all the time. You can't just get sick and go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, give me some pills," and then 2 weeks later you're fine, right? If you're a farmer and you're working outside and you cut your finger, that finger, if it gets infected, it can kill you. You would never, I worked on a farm when I was young, and farms are dangerous, but it's not like if I cut myself on a piece of metal, I'm going to get tetanus, and then I'm going to get lockjaw, and I'm going to be paralyzed in a few years because I've been infected by a certain disease. That kind of stuff we could deal with. They could not. So everybody lived with the reality that death was right there all the time. And you got to remember that. This is something different than us. I said it's early modern, right? This 17th century life is early modern. One of the reasons, there are many reasons, but it's not modern. It's early modern. It's not postmodern like us. We're postmodern because we have the internet, for example. Modern people didn't. Modern people had machines and cars, but they didn't have smartphones. That's postmodern, and art and other things too. But I'm just saying, the current society has certain things like smartphones and the internet, and it means we're all connected all the time. That is different than living in 1930. But what's the same is that we have cars, they have cars. Early modern people don't have machines, they don't have internet, they also don't have medicine. Okay? Penicillin wasn't discovered until the 20th century, so it's going to be a long time for people to understand that. Not to understand, people started to understand, I guess, before that where disease came from, but it's going to be a long time down the road before people are like, "Oh, I'm sick, let me just get something that'll definitely get rid of it. All I have to do is have the money," or in the case that you live in a country like Korea or Canada that's got a good healthcare system, I just have to pay a little bit of money and I'm just going to get some multicolored pills, eat them, and it's not going to be a big deal. None of that. So you got the diseases always being a problem. In the 17th century also, there's the political situation where England is somewhat isolated. That is tied to the religious problem. So in England, you have different religious factions. The Protestant faction is the main one, but within the Protestant faction, you have different versions of Protestantism as well. So the main division is originally, in the 16th century, Catholic and Protestant. But when you get to the 17th century, it's not that anymore. Now it's like Catholic is a small factor, but then you got Anglican, one type of Protestant, and then you have Presbyterian, another type, which is Scottish. Anglican is English. And then you have Puritan, which is another type of Protestantism, which they call dissenter, a type of dissenter, which is more radical change from the Catholic Church. And then you have other things too, like Quakers, because Quakers shake and they have a more dramatic response to their faith in the Bible, and Baptists, who believe that you shouldn't, join the church and have baptism when you're young, but do it as an adult. And there's other groups too. I'm leaving some out because I'm going to talk about this next lecture as well when I talk about King James and his son Charles after that and the Civil War. So religion becomes a big factor, but essentially England is kind of, by 17th century, it's definitely Protestant, What type of Protestant has not been determined. So now we got Catholics against Protestants, but Protestants against each other. So it gets really complex. And that's happening in other countries too. But England is, as a whole, Protestant. France is Catholic. Spain is Catholic. Germany's all mixed up. But England's Protestant. The Netherlands, the Dutch, are also Protestant. But as far as like kings and queens are concerned, basically Queen Elizabeth is the only Protestant. While she's ruling, she's the only kingdom that's like fully Protestant with a unified state that's Protestant. So that kind of isolates her. And that's one of the reasons the Spanish Armada tries to land in England and take it over, is because, you know, Catholic Europe is trying to reabsorb England because it's like a renegade state, kind of. So you got the religion, you got the diseases. Spain gets super rich. And who cares about Spain getting super rich? Everybody. Because Spain gets super rich and they stop, essentially it ruins the Spanish economy. This sounds kind of crazy, I know. I'm not an economist, but Spain gets super rich and you'd think all that money would just solve all their problems, but it doesn't, because they start buying everything, and everything, there's a huge inflation. So because the Spanish have all this gold and silver, they just start buying everything with gold and silver. So since there's so much, there's like an oversupply of gold and silver, they just start buying everything with their gold and silver. So the price of things is inflated. So some, like a piece of bread that used to cost like a tiny amount of a metal, now it's like a piece of gold to buy a bread. I'm not saying that's just an example. That's not the case. But everything cost more. And this inflation, the Spanish got so much money from the gold and silver in South America and Mexico. They got so much of it that it caused inflation in every country in Europe. So England was not, had the same problem. Prices were going up, and the money was worth less, which is a big problem. And I'm not going to explain to you why. Go and ask your economics professor why that's the case. China also had a really big problem because Spain just basically injected a huge amount of gold and silver into China and almost ruined their economy because of such a sudden increase in the supply of money. It's not good for your economy when you do that. So inflation is a big problem too. The population starts increasing. This is kind of the opposite situation from the Black Death. After the Black Death, the population is cut by 30%. In some cities, it's even more, like 50%. So the price of labor goes up and you get paid more. But now the population is starting to rise. So there's people having more kids, even though there's diseases that kind of push the population down a bit. Generally, the trend is upward. So you have more people than you've had in a long time, which means there's not, the economy in England is not very flexible. So there's not enough jobs and there's a lot of people. And that means people have to work more for less money. So that's a problem too. The price of food, because the food supply is basically static, but the number of people is up and the wages are stagnant, it means that the price of food goes up like 400% by the beginning of the 16th century. By the beginning of the 17th century, over 100 years, it goes up 400%, but the amount of money that people make does not. It's kind of like the situation the millennials have now, like me, where, the price of housing has gone up 500% since I was born, or the 1970s anyway. And you're all the same as me because you're younger than me. It's even worse for you. The amount of money that I make, let's say I make double, not even, but let's just say I make double the amount of money of my father and my mother did, but they bought a house for 5 times less. So the amount of money I made doubled, but the cost of a house has gone up 5 times. So I can't afford a house because the amount of money I earn compared to the cost of things hasn't increased enough. This is a problem across all of Western cultures, but especially in North America and Canada and the United States. Same kind of thing. Cost of food goes up 400%. The real wages go up 100%. So you have to pay 4 times as much for food, and you make double the money, or not even, right? And that means that you can't save money, and in some cases you have to give up what you own if you have land and you don't make enough money to support your family. So there's all these people that get displaced. It's a huge number, thousands and thousands of people that just can't pay their rent, or can't pay their property taxes, or can't feed their families. So they just leave, and they just move around and try and find something to do. A lot of them move to the city. So this is pre-industrial, but this is what happens at the beginning. So it's a really big problem, in the background of all these other things that we study. So yeah, all of these things are happening simultaneously. And Elizabeth, because she's so popular, and because she's a figure that is respected, she won multiple wars against Spain. There's not high taxes. It's another issue, is that she keeps the taxes relatively low and tries to find other ways of earning money. Some of them we'll talk about them next class. She's able to do these things without spending too much money and without raising taxes, which is going to be a problem for later rulers who are not able to do that, namely her nephew James and his son Charles. They're not going to be able to keep their government going, especially because they love spending money. But even besides that, they just don't have enough money to run the government and to fight wars against other countries, because the tax has been so low that they can't. People are not going to adjust to a tax rate that jumps suddenly. So Queen Elizabeth has kind of delayed a lot of the issues. She hasn't dealt with some of these fundamental problems that are, sort of bubbling underneath. The religious problems, the inflation, the economic problems, the political problems, the religious problems. All these things are just kind of, she keeps everything suppressed is the wrong word. She keeps everything, she maintains the status quo, which everybody likes. Everybody likes life to be normal. But after she dies, it's really hard for James to keep it going. And then I think even though Charles I, I'm sorry to say this, Charles, but he's an idiot in a lot of ways. He's not Queen Elizabeth or James. I think Queen Elizabeth is in some ways a genius, and James is competent in some ways, and his son Charles is just politically incompetent, and his personality and his abilities, leadership is to blame for many of the problems, but also he was dealt a terrible hand. He ended up with a horrible situation. But so was Queen Elizabeth. So this is not something he couldn't have dealt with if he had been an exceptional leader, but he was not. And that results when you have a serious crisis, a culmination of problems in your country, and you have poor leadership. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about the 17th century, remember? If that happens, you end up with basically, I mean, in this case, it's a civil war, but essentially you end up with a crisis turning into a disaster. So we are going to talk more about how this whole situation develops, how the disaster occurs, how the details of the disaster in the 17th century, and how England comes out the other end somehow in pretty good shape. And I guess a very good parallel, we'll be talking about this after what would normally be the midterm. Later in the semester, we'll be talking about the American Civil War. It is a complete disaster. The American Civil War is a bloody, horrible war. It's a complete disaster, but somehow the United States comes out the other end, one of the most powerful countries in the world. And we got to talk about that too. It's a revolution and a turning point, and it's a huge change in American culture. and it is many people suffer and die, just like in England in the 17th century. So it's good to examine these events and understand exactly how these things that are disastrous for an entire generation turn into something that in the long term looks like almost like the culture, gets stronger after having gone through that disaster. So that's the introduction to the 17th century. I will continue. That's enough for now. I know this is 40 minutes, but this is my best effort at a bite-sized portion of this week's lecture, and we will continue this in a second and third part this week. So please watch this whole video. Don't stop the video partway through. Get right through it, because all of this stuff is relevant. As I said, if you listen carefully to what I say, the textbook, and read the textbook to review what I'm talking about, then you'll have a good idea of what you need to understand to do well on the exam. And the exam's going to be worth a lot, as I said, because of our remote communication. The exam's going to be worth more than usual. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good night and talk to you soon.